Okay, we just started talking about the data standards. And so later on, when we start typing a bunch of stuff in an SQL prompt, we might say something like, Bob. And if we do, it probably should be like that with single quotes. If you're using Microsoft Access, yes, it will allow you to do it like that. Doing dates is different. Typically, the native format for a date would be, 2022 dash, 04-22, something like that. Okay, that's a normal way that databases would do it, except for Microsoft Access, which uses little pound signs, which is kind of funky. So, if I go in here and say 02 dash or 04 dash 02 dash 2022 pound. So I try to spend more time teaching you how to do things in the data standard way, which would be the Microsoft SQL Server technique. But whenever you do go to Microsoft Access, you have to know what the differences are. Okay, on page 8, we'll start talking about relationships. So in this example between students and classes, clearly there's some sort of a relationship between this, because a single student can have multiple classes and a single class can have multiple students. So clearly there's kind of a relationship there. So let's just take a look at this guy. So here's how they did it. They built a separate table, okay? And they related this table called grade. Part of it is related to the student table, and part of it is related to the class table. So now I know that Sam Cook took Chemistry 101 and he made a 3.7. And Sam Cook also took Accounting 101 and he made a 3.5. Okay? See how this thing works? So this is just an example of a relationship in operation. Okay. So the term we use to describe this out loud in English, it's has a student has a class. A student has a grade. A class has students. Okay? So either has a or has. It's just the English way of describing this thing, so it kind of makes sense. Okay. So this shows a different view of that same thing. In Microsoft Access, this is the way it looks like. I have a student table and a class table. And then when you do this, it draws lines for you. It draws a line between the grade table and the student table and the class table and the grade table. And that line represents the relationship. So you get to see it graphically when we get to that point in Microsoft Access. Okay, the next thing we can talk about is the types of keys. And this is kind of sort of important, so you might want to be paying a little bit of attention. So there's lots of different types of keys and lots of different names for keys, so just try to keep this straight. So a primary key. A primary key is something that will uniquely identify a row. So for example, if I pick student number 1, I know I'm always going to get that guy. And if I pick student number 3, so there's never going to be more than one student number 3, right? So it uniquely identifies a row. A primary key, that's what the primary key does for a living. It uniquely identifies a row. And then a surrogate key. A surrogate key is where the machine fills it in, sort of like an auto number. Instead of you typing in 1 and the next one is a 2 and the next one is a 3, you just tell the machine, look, I'll do the counting for you. You don't have to worry about that. But this goes by several different names. It's called a surrogate key. It's called an auto number. It's called a synthetic key. Three different ways of describing the exact same thing. I typically say auto number because it just kind of sort of sounds right. Because surrogate, that doesn't mean anything to most people. But so this could be, for example, an auto number. I can't tell by looking, but it could be an auto number so that you automatically add the next person on the list and it'll automatically fill in that one as 5. Okay. A compound key. Well, it turns out that sometimes in order to uniquely identify something, for example, if I said student number uniquely identifies the rows, well, clearly not, because if I said uniquely identifies, that means there cannot be any duplicates. So in this case, I need both the student and the class together. So 2 columns put together to make one key. It's called a compound key. Sometimes they call it a composite key. Now, I tend to say compound key, so Just remember how I describe it. So what if I said compound primary key, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And then a foreign key. So a foreign key is the thing that glues two tables together. For example, this student number is both part of a compound primary key and it is a foreign key. Yep, a column can do both. So this key points back to that key, and this column points back to that column. And so the mechanics for doing that is for some other chapter, but I'm just saying that a foreign key's job is to glue two tables together. That's what it does for a living. Okay, so on page 10, they talk about information. So I remember that the goofy definition was information, doing something useful with data. Okay, so if you increase in value, that means you're doing something with the data and making it more useful. A lot of companies are just drowning in raw data. They have tons of data, but they don't know what to do with it. In fact, there are companies out there that you can hire to come look at your data and tell you what it says, because it's that complicated. If you collect, well, I don't know, you're McDonald's, and you collect every single thing, you know exactly at 2 p.m., somebody ordered a Big Mac, with extra cheese. And so how useful is that, in the big scheme of things, corporate-wide, 50 states? You'd be drowning in data. So you need to have an awful lot of information being extracted from that. So there's a thing called data mining, which means I've got tons and tons of data, but I don't know what it means. And then there's a data presentation, which basically means, okay, now that I've got the data and I've made some sense out of it, I've increased its value, I need to be able to present it in a way that kind of makes sense to upper management. Remember, a lot of these people, okay, I'm kind of poking fun at upper management, but a lot of folks in upper management are not database people, and they're not going to know what all this stuff means. You got to draw them some pretty pictures, and that's what that's about. So, a database example on page 10. So, this is what an example looks like. So here's one where I have a database. So it could be like a sales contact. And so example users would be like one user. I mean, one person has their own private thing. It could be done in a thing called Goldmine or ACT, or, you could do it in Microsoft Access. And then maybe a little higher. So you have some medical office and maybe you got, I don't know, a dozen or so people running it. So okay, well now I need to have, a vendor come in and set something up, some sort of corporate database. And then, I got a sales marketing for a massive thing, with 500 users, like Microsoft or Oracle or somebody else is probably going to be doing this. And then enterprise resource planning, well, ERP is a cool term. And you could have, 10 million rows in your database. And so you're probably using a product called SAP or something like that. And then e-commerce, you could have millions of people hitting the database, like Amazon. And they're going to use multiple databases, probably scattered all over the place, not just a single database. And then, senior management, a digital dashboard. And a dashboard is just something simple, like a speedometer kind of thing, how well we're doing, or maybe a red, amber, green to say, how are sales doing in the Southwest? And if it shows green, they just nod their head and go, oh, okay. It's designed to make it just kind of simple. Extracts data, increases the value by making some good presentation. And then data mining, that's where you have millions and millions of data. For example, I don't know, let's say you had access to all of the U.S. Census data, and you wanted to know, I don't know, how many people over the age of 35 with at least a college degree, bought kumquats last week, that kind of stuff. Where you have tons and tons and tons of data, millions and millions of rows. Okay, so let's step into this a little bit further. A single user database, okay? So designed typically for one user. I would consider Microsoft Access as one of those. I mean, it will work with multiple users, but that wasn't what it was really designed for. It is file-based, which means there's no server. Remember this example way back here when I showed you at the very beginning? Where this is a database and there's a server you have to go through. Well, the file-based ones like Microsoft Access, they don't have a server. The server is the PC that it's installed upon. But a multi-user database, that implies a server, okay? I have to have some sort of a server. Somebody has to be the gatekeeper. Who's authorized to get on and that kind of stuff, right? So, a customer relationship management, a CRM or an enterprise resource, an ERP, those guys, clearly they're going to have a server of some sort. And then e-commerce, doing business over the web, that's a good definition. Amazon, they probably, I don't know how big they are, but I would imagine they do hundreds of thousands of transactions per second, just to keep up. And then reporting and data mining, of course, these are, trying to make it simple for upper management, red, amber, green, or something like that. So on page 12, they're talking about the components. So typically a database has these components, okay? 4 parts. They have the user, right? And then some sort of a database application, could be like on a phone or a PC or whatever. And then it goes through a database management system and then goes to the database. Now, I'll tell you right off the bat, users do not leap over and talk to the database directly. No one does that. Not the database administrator, not the programmer. Nobody bypasses the DBMS. The DBMS is the traffic cop. It's the one that says, whoa, 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 you don't have permissions. Or, I need to create a new table, or I need to modify a table, or I need to insert a table. The database is sort of like the bucket where all the data is stored, but this is where all the smarts are, is in the database management system. Okay. So, users, application, management, and database. Those are good things to remember. Hint, 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 hint. And so now we need to talk about structured query language, SQL. We're going to be using the term SQL an awful lot in this course. So it's basically how you interact with the database. You would connect to a DBMS, and then you would type in a command. Okay, I'm gonna fake this because I don't have a database running right this very second. But I would say something like select asterisk from student, and I would submit that command. This is a valid SQL command that says go to some table called student and return every column that you see. Select asterisk from student. Anyway, it's how you interact with the database, and it is somewhat analogous to a command prompt. Like popping out to the command prompt in Windows. There is a GUI way of doing this, a graphical user interface GUI. There's a GUI way of doing this, but we won't be doing that until after Chapter 10. Okay, so we're going to be at the command prompt for the vast majority of the course. Okay, so let's just go through the database piece. So that's where the actual tables and relationships are. And quite frankly, it's hard for the human to actually see the database. You never actually get to see this guy. The database management system, yeah, you get to see that. That's the gatekeeper. And now, just one more time, if it's file-based, you don't actually have a database management system. The application, this is the front end. This could be a web page, or it could be an application on your phone. Your contacts in your phone, that's a database. And so there's a little form, right? You put in the person's name and their work phone and their cell phone and their email address, and you hit save. That's a front-end application for a database stored on your phone. Okay. And then, of course, the pesky humans. They're the last piece of that. So, talking about the key features of a DBMS on page 15. So, what does a DBMS do? Because, right, it fits between you and the database. Well, it's for, creating things. You're creating a new database, or creating tables, or modifying things. You're inserting things. You're reading the database, you're maintaining the structure, you're enforcing the rules. If I said, the state names are 2-letter abbreviation, and you start putting in more than 2 letters, the machine's going to come back and say, nah, nah, nah. There's some rules associated with this. And then concurrency. And concurrency is kind of strange. That means if 2 people are trying to access the record at the same time, somebody has to be the arbitrator. Somebody has to say, now, wait a minute. You can't both be accessing the very same record at the exact same time. And then, of course, backup and recovery kinds of things. Okay, so once again, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark. By now, you know how this works.